welcome to the Past President's Address. My name is Gary Langham. I am the AAG Executive Director, and I'm honored to introduce Marilyn. Marilyn is past president of the AAG, having served from 2022 to 2023. She is also the director of the UCLA Institute for the Environment and Sustainability, professor of geography at UCLA, and served as department chair from 2010 to 2013. So the sheet of paper I have has 2 more paragraphs about all her amazing academic accomplishments, but if you're here in this meeting, I'm sure you're already familiar with that lengthy list. So instead, let me tell you something else, which is just how treasured it has been for AAG to have Marilyn as a leader these last 3 years. Marilyn, it's been a really difficult, challenging time for AAG, and your very steady leadership, your always thoughtful comments have really just made an amazing difference for the whole organization. I wish we could keep this going as long as possible. It has truly been amazing. And your leadership has been critical to AAG, and your scholarship has been critical to the world. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Marilyn for the address.
Thanks, Gary. I'm nervous, and it's actually funny because I have to stand in front of people every time as part of my job, but I'm still a little bit nervous. However, I'm excited as well, and so delighted that today we can have a conversation with 2 senior leading geographers about moving towards a just geography. Before we get there, though, I want to tell you a little bit about our, I'll say, panelists, about our awardees. And I'll begin with Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Ruthie. Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is recognized for her extraordinary contributions to the confrontation with racial capitalism and the conditions necessary for structural reform, particularly of carceral institutions and prison systems, mass punishment, and criminalization and race. She has also shared her expertise in labor and social movements, the intersections of race and gender, the African diaspora, and Black radical tradition. As director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, she has mentored geographers with her boundless dedication to the possible. Hope is a pedagogical tool in Dr. Gilmore's hands, used incisively to question the status quo and imagine a different future of restorative rather than punitive approaches to justice and civic life. She's also the co-author and author of more than a dozen books. I won't say them all here, but they include The Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California, and Change Everything, Racial Capitalism and the Case for Abolition, as well as numerous papers. A frequent honoree for her visionary work, Gilmore is the recipient of the 2022 Margaret Casey Freedom Scholar Prize, a member of the American Academy of Arts since 2021, and recipient of the 2021 National Book Foundation Prize, and co-honoree of the 2020 Lannan Foundation Lifetime Cultural Freedom Prize with Angela Davis and Michael Davis. From the AAG, she has received the 2020 Lifetime Achievement Honors, and in 2014, the Harold Rose Award for Anti-Racist Research and Practice. This year, Dr. Ruthie Gilmore is the recipient of the Presidential Achievement Award. Alongside Ruthie, and alongside is important, they are elevated and alongside, is Dr. Marshall Shepard. Dr. Marshall Shepard is recognized for the creative use of his expertise on weather, climate, and remote sensing toward raising public awareness, increasing the public's understanding of climate change, and drawing attention to the importance of geography and the need to create a more diverse, just discipline. His areas of research include urban climate, hydrometeorological extremes, weather climate risk, and innovative outreach strategies. Dr. Shepard is the Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Georgia, and he serves as Associate Director of Climate and Outreach for the Institute of Resilient Infrastructure Systems. He's a full professor in the Department of Geography, where he was the previous Associate Department Head. And now, since 2023, he is the Associate Dean for Research Scholarship and Partnerships in the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Georgia. His extensive public scholarship includes hosting the Weather Channel's award-winning Weather Geeks and serving as a senior contributor to Forbes magazine. He has written editorials for CNN, The Washington Post, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and other outlets, and he has been featured in Time magazine, Popular Mechanics, and NPR's Science Friday. And also with the public, he routinely appears on CBS Face the Nation, Nova, the Today Show, and other stations and programs. With nearly 100 peer-reviewed scholarly publications, Dr. Shepard has also attracted several millions of dollars in extramural funding support from NASA, the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the U.S. Forest Service, and others. I'm going to just stop with that list there. This is a distillation of both of their achievements, and it's at some point I have to stop, otherwise I can email you the CD. But let me finish. The recipient of many honors, including the AAG Media Achievement Award, Dr. Shepard was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He remains dedicated to creating curiosity and opportunities for students, and especially Black students, to increase diversity in the discipline. Here, he has authored a book entitled The Race Awakening of 2020, a 6-step guide to move forward. This year, he is the recipient of the Presidential Achievement Award. And you will hear from them in a moment, maybe a little bit longer than a moment, because I want to set this stage. The AAG theme in 2023 was one that I chose, and it's towards a just geography. There, we describe a just geography not simply a condition or place, but rather a goal towards which we should work. It's also not spatially or temporally fixed, nor is it something that we can achieve and then move on. Rather, a just geography sits somewhere on the near horizon, something we envision and can work to get close to together. We saw and heard powerful statements from 3 early career scholars, Dr. Tiana Bruno, Dr. Kelly Kay, and Dr. Guillermo Ramos Douglas. Some of you will not have been here, so let me give you a distillation of what they said. Kelly Kay, who studies the political economy of the environment and nature's society geographies, noted, when we ask ourselves how to create more just geographies, it is critical that we recognize that much of the discipline is made and remade in the spaces where we work. recognizing that justice is produced through relationships, that it is a product of a situated and often difficult set of engagements among people. She drew on her own experiences as well as a diverse set of discussions with colleagues and graduate students to make a presentation that focused on the ways that we work within our workplaces and institutional spaces towards building more just geographies. Guillermo Ramos Douglas, whose research focuses on the social and spatial determinants of health, he uses geospatial analysis and qualitative research methods to highlight localized health disparities. He asked, where is justice located? If we knew, we could plot our course. How can we orient ourselves towards the horizon of social and ecological justice? He recognized that the spatial and temporal dimensions of justice are shaped by processes across all scales, from the macro, global systems of oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., to the micro, when these sentiments are internalized, and then all of the messy entanglements in between. He recognized, too, that our ability to move towards justice is vast when we work together. Tiana Bruno, using critical physical geography as an example, illustrated that more just geographies are unattainable without the new world building analytics, frameworks, and practices for decolonization and the abolition of slavery's many afterlives, both social and ecological. That the question of more just geographies must be informed by theoretical and methodological interventions in other geographies. She demonstrated this, drawing together analyses of environmental records and Black geographies to examine the interrelationship between racial and environmental histories in Black communities facing environmental justice. She posed a question: can physical geography be a tool for abolition and decolonization? So there we heard from the scholars who are just now starting. In fact, Tiana got her first tenure track job a couple of weeks after her presentation. And I had nothing to do with it, but I'm really proud of her. In today's session, we take the idea of a just geography a little further, looking through the eyes of two senior leaders in the field, Dr. Ruth Gilmore and Dr. Marshall Shepard. These are two geographers who have, importantly, experienced the past. They're very active in the present, and they're looking forward to the future. As the panelists of last year did, they will speak with passion. They will share ideas, opinions, and directions arising from their own study, experiences, and hopes. And as happened last year, the topics discussed will at times dwell on ideas that bring discomfort. We ask that you embrace that discomfort, use it for reflection on why that is and how it might be changed. That's, apart from the questions, that's most of what you'll be hearing from me. In preparation for today's conversation, I prepared a number of questions, and I shared these with Ruthie and Marshall. And in creating some of these questions, I asked people what they would like to hear them talk about. So I will ask them these questions, and in turn, they will answer. They may even question themselves as this goes on. And I've reserved a little time towards the end for questions from the audience, because I know I haven't asked everything you want to know. So the first question is this, and Ruthie, I'll ask you to answer first. You've lived and thrived, and you've risen to the top of your field, a field that is arguably, let me get my sense, that arguably was not just. In fact, one might argue that as you were coming along, questions of justice were not discussed. How would you professional life have been different had geography been just? How would your appointments have been different? Your relationship with colleagues, the intellectual path that you followed? A lot of questions, but it's all embedded.
First, I want to thank you, Dr. Marilyn Raphael, for this amazing honor. And I'm so thrilled to be, however, virtually in the room with you and Dr. Marshall Shepard. This is fantastic and not something I imagined when I was in geography in early days. And as many people know, but not everybody knows, I started in geography as a 43-year-old person who had done a lot of things already in life. And I found my way to geography because it appeared to be an adequately unruly discipline such that I could put together the vast array of questions that really obsessed and perplexed me, and I could learn within the huge field of geography ways to answer those questions, whether they were about the natural world or social theory or anything in between. Having stumbled into geography in 1993, I was actually quite taken aback by how, well, just to use your words, how unjust it seemed to be. And yet, I wasn't actually deeply surprised because I had been around the academy for a very, very, very long time in a variety of situations in the arts as well as the social sciences. And so I didn't have expectations that justice would be the experience that would enable me to do the kind of research and learning and writing that I wound up doing. And the people who made the biggest difference for me in those early days were the late, great Clyde Woods, who was a student himself at the time, but he advised me and counseled me. We taught each other a lot. And the great, great Joe Darden, who's now retired from Michigan State, who to this day is a beacon for all of us. And if any of you listening don't know who he is, shame on you, find out and read all of his books. Nobody writes more brilliantly about the city of Detroit. And I think if there's one thing from those early days that I would like to have go away that still linger, even with all the change in personnel and the kinds of people we've brought into the profession, it's the habit people have in geography, but not exclusively, of teaching bad stuff because they feel obliged to do some kind of representation of the entire breadth of thinking in the field. And that's an absurd thing to do. And I deeply object to it. When there's so much amazing, good, strong, compelling stuff, old and new, that we could be and should be teaching and learning. And so that goes from how we organize undergraduate courses, to how we organize graduate teaching, to the kinds of panels and events that populate our scholarly meetings, and how we do peer review for our journals. So that's my long answer to your first question.
Thank you, Ruthie. Thank you. I think as Ruthie and as Marshall talk, you will gather your questions, and I will pick them up later. Yes, Marshall. Should I read the question back to you?
No.
Okay.
No. I think I can take it. So first of all, thank you, Marilyn, for this opportunity and this honor, and to share the virtual stage with clearly someone that I don't feel worthy of sharing a stage with virtually, but it's an honor indeed. I want to also thank the AAG, their executive director, its council, and all members for honoring us with your presence today, either in person there in Hawaii or virtually. So in order for me to sort of address the question about just geographies, and I have to talk about my marinade. I often talk in my discussions publicly about marinades because we're all familiar with marinades and how marinades sort of transition flavor to perhaps a piece of meat or vegetables. My marinade is that I grew up in a small rural community in North Georgia, just outside of the metropolitan Atlanta area, to a single mother who was an educator. I was an only child, and so the natural world inspired me. As I reflected on my thoughts tonight, I thought about sort of the discipline of geography as a scholar now within Department of Geography at the University of Georgia. But I was living elements of the various subdisciplines, if you will, of geography, even at that moment as a curious fifth grader catching honeybees. Because at that time, I was fascinated by honeybees, even though I was stung by one and almost died and learned that I was highly allergic to them. Sixth grade science project comes around, and I needed a plan B, and pun intended, I guess, and discovered weather and climate, did a science project, and the rest is history. I wanted to study how weather and climate work. Climatology is inherently, and physical geography and geosciences are inherently weaved together. But I also was growing up in the 70s in Georgia at a time when I didn't have mentors or scientists that looked like me in my radius of influence. My mentor was Dr. George Washington Carver, a peanut scientist at Tuskegee Institute. Never met the man, but read everything I could about him in the library. From that point on, the naive me says, I want to go and study weather and climate. However, I was always typically the only person in my classes that looked like me. As I ascended into a position at NASA, typically I was the only person in the room that looked like me. I have emails to this day. There are threads that challenge why I'm in the discipline. I am just the African American using build a career. I have been questioned in the room simply as a product of affirmative action and what they're calling DEI today, in terms of using that as a discriminatory tactic, when we all know that it's about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our field. I want to read something that I wrote with my colleagues Jake Bendix and Michael Urban recently, published in the AGU's EOS. We wrote an opinion piece discussing the lack of diversity within the physical geography discipline. And one of the things that we highlighted, we made the statement, the mere absence of intentional discrimination is not enough to ensure diversity. So as I think about unjust geography, as I think about the marinades that have shaped us all, we inherently have our interests, we have our expertise, and we have our disciplinary strengths. But yet when we look around, at least in the physical geography space or the climatology space or the American Meteorological Society space, where I served as president several years ago, there are many efforts, great intentions, fellowships, scholarships, and programs, and yet the numbers are still minimal. So clearly a new approach is needed. And so I look forward to the discussion tonight. Half the battle is just presenting alternatives and options, because mentorship is very important. Dr. Warren Washington, climatologist, is one of the key mentors in my life. And so if I can inspire one person today listening online or in the room, I think we're moving the needle forward towards a more just geography.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to the next question, because I think from what both of you have said, there are questions down here on my page that that you might be able to return to what you said and answer. So, given what you've lived your marinade, and learned how, and what you've just said, actually, how would you bend the arc of geography towards justness? And I will have to say that I really wanted to say those words because I really like the imagery of this thing. It's not my words. You all know this phrase. But how would you bend this arc of geography towards justice now? What would you do as an individual? What would you have AAG do? What could other individual members of geography do? And Ruthie, that question's coming at you as well when Marshall's finished.
So I'll start by saying, and again, I'm drawing on things that I've recently thought about and written about with Mike and Jake. So this is really quite timely given the honor, but also some of the things that we recently wrote about in EOS. The current lack of physical geography reflects a lack of awareness by members of marginalized and communities of color, and the challenges these students face on entering the field. And so I think it's imperative that organizations like the AAG and the AGU and the AMS are very intentional about its programming, its outreach, even reaching out to perhaps institutions, schools, institutions of higher learning that don't even have a strong geography presence. We all know, and I've written about this several times in Forbes, of the importance of geography and geographic thought and methods to almost every aspect of our lives. We know that. Many of our public and students don't know that, and they don't necessarily have pathways to learn and understand that. One of the things that I challenged in that article with my colleagues, Michael and Jake, is this idea of always talking about a pipeline. A pipeline is a terrible analogy. It's a terrible analogy because it assumes there's one way in and one way out, when in fact we need multiple pathways to increase just geography, exposure, and broaden participation. I'll give you two examples. Dr. Marcus Williams was the first African American to receive a PhD from the Department of Geography at the University of Georgia. He's now a scientist at the U.S. Forest Service. Dr. Bradford Johnson, the second African American male to receive a PhD in the Department of Geography at the University of Georgia. Both of those were students that I actively recruited. And one of them I recruited as a partnership with Marilyn Raphael through a Diversity ClimeNet grant that we had with our colleague Leslie Ann Dupinier-Chevreau. There was an intentionality to that. So we can study the problem, we can be scholarly and pose hypotheses and theories and write books, but we have to be intentional. The only way I moved the needle in that space was intentionally recruiting these young men, looking past the barriers and narratives and artificial metrics and so forth that have shaped and framed the academy for many years. Both of those young men are very successful in their career right now, but had we completely relied on some of the gateway metrics that often we think about, they still would likely be there, but some people doubted them. And so these are opportunities for the AAG, its membership, and everyone within my voice tonight to think about ways we can be intentional and not just scholarly and academic with the problem.
Thank you, Marshall.
Yeah, I'll pick up right where Marshall left off and talk about some additional ways for us to think about being intentional given what we do for a living. For example, the organization of courses. And this is certainly true for people on the social science or the human geography end. And it probably resonates very nicely with those who are in the sciences who work in groups. A type of course that I developed almost 30 years ago, before I started in graduate school, but that became sort of one of my signatures throughout my career, has been the studio course. Now, I didn't invent studios, they already existed, but I used them for undergraduate as well as graduate education in order to bring people in to a really lively engagement with what doing geography can be. So, for example, when I taught at Berkeley a million years ago, I would teach these studio courses in the theme was, not surprising to anyone listening, carceral geography. I innovated a course and wrote it up and got it approved. And I had up to 75 people doing studio work with me, working in groups, going out and studying to shreds cities that I would assign to them, cities in California, and writing from whatever their interest was as a group, an analysis of this place where prisons were put, or a place that refused prisons, so that they could understand as thickly as possible what that aspect of the prison industrial complex consisted of. It was really great. And a lot of people who came through those courses went on to do PhDs or to become organizers or in other ways to live a life devoted to justice. I continue to do studio courses with doctoral students, though these courses tend to be smaller, of course, because they're for PhD students. And so there might be 12 if I'm teaching alone. Sometimes I'll pair up with an artist who's also an organizer and educator, a fantastic person called Shalene Rodriguez. And we mix artists and geographers. And they learn not only how to work together, but they learn about seeing from each other's disciplinary activities. So geographers learn to see again through artists, and artists learn to see again through geographers. And this also is a way to bring people into the profession. And then finally, whatever it is we're studying, at least one of the themes that should shape our work, and I know it shapes Dr. Marshall Shepard's work, and that is the study of people and places that have experienced or continue to experience organized abandonment, but not only so that we can write down all the terrible things that are true about the world, because that is not enough. That's just what should start us on the path toward that arc of justice. And the arc of justice demands that we also figure out, as thickly as possibly, how people change, refuse, undo their own abandonment. And many of my students who have come through and done PhDs with me, including people like May Miller-Lekete and Celeste Winston, Zaire Simone Thompson, Jenna Lloyd, Keith Miyake, Jack Norton, Lydia Pello-Hobbs, Marlene Ramos, Wendy Chang, Sharon Look, David Stein, Allison Guess, and others have done the work to find these alternatives, even if they started with the terror of organized abandonment and the role of organized violence in keeping the abandoned in their place.
I want to applaud. Thank you. So one of the things I'm realizing is I've prepared these questions carefully, and I can see distinctions between the questions and the answers that I've kind of made up in my head. And what Ruthie and Marshall have done is that they're kind of answering all of my questions at once. So I'm still going to ask the question because there might be some things that they haven't addressed, and it might sound like a repetition, but repetition is good in this context. And Ruthie, you're here. I'll ask you this because this is a question I got directly from one of the panelists in this particular session last year, and it's what paths towards a more just geographies can you see, such as directly how can we live up to the calls of abolition geographies? This was something someone really wanted to know.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you to the person who posed it, I guess last year. I think that I have started to answer that question as you suggested
Yes.
in what I was discussing in talking about, in particular, the work that my former students who are now out in the world teaching their own students worked up, developed. And the answer, how do we heed the call for abolition geography, is as multifaceted as our profession is, our methodological toolkits are, and the kinds, therefore, of questions we ask and are able to try to put together at least provisional answers for. And I'm gonna try something out. I might fall flat on my face, but I'm hoping not. Marilyn, I know that you, as a scientist, do modeling. I suspect that you, Marshall, also do modeling. And I have never been somebody who uses the powerful tools of quantitative analysis to do the kind of work that I'm doing, but in recent years, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of conceptualizing problems and their solutions through models. If we think about models, not only in the way that you two and people in your parts of the profession do them, but also how modeling works in the world of art. If we think about clay and putting together a sculpture, we think about, incredibly plastic material that has a certain kind of stretch to it and can be arranged and rearranged and so forth. And that kind of modeling is really what we're trying to uncover, reveal, give some narrative sense to in the research we do, whether it is how vulnerable people who have been in the crosshairs of criminalization in the United States or elsewhere for years and years have worked out ways to reduce harm in their community and not call the police. Not call the police. That's an example. And Celeste Winston wrote a whole book about this in which she looks back through time on that question. Or how people who, like many millions and millions of people around the planet who are been displaced because of the kind of joint crises of conflict and climate, have moved to, greater and greater, bigger and bigger urban areas where there is a deficit of housing. What have they done? And the struggle over housing is one of the key struggles. It goes hand in hand with climate and conflict for the 21st century. So I've done some work now on and off for the last almost decade with communities in South Africa who do land occupations and build houses and then defend them and turn them into communities, right? So this is going against certain expectations of who should control property and who can provide housing. And yet, they're not anarchists. They're not saying we'll do this on our own and everybody leave us alone. They are building houses because nobody else is building them for them, forming communities together. That solidarity is essential. And then demanding demanding that the provincial state or the central state provide water and other utilities and schools and healthcare for the people in that community, right? So this is, again, it's a different kind of model, and see the plasticity of the social that depends on the human environment relations, as well as on the kinds of things we in social science are more likely to count, and that is demographics and dollars and other things that start with Ds.
Yeah, could I pick up there, because Ruthie's given me some nice areas to sort of really follow up on, if that's okay, Marilyn?
Please do.
Yeah, so I was thinking about, first of all, this honor, because, as many of you know, and I know some of you online in the room that are familiar with my career, I came from a meteorology and climate background, and I was at NASA for 12 years as a scientist. And when I got some offers to move into the academy, there were opportunities to move in what I would call more traditional atmospheric sciences and meteorology programs. But the Department of Geography at the University of Georgia was really calling me, because the work that I was doing was inherently not just about rainfall and hurricanes. I was doing work at the intersection of weather, climate, urbanization, and as Ruthie just talked about, as we have climate displacement and climate migrations into urban spaces, the urban environment and the rural environment have particular vulnerabilities to the shifting weather and climate. I know she's somewhere in Hawaii. My first PhD student, Dr. Chandana Mitra at Auburn University, was my first PhD student at the University of Georgia. And her work on urban impacts of rainfall and urban growth in Kolkata, India, though it was miles and miles away from Canton, Georgia, where I grew up, there was a common thread, this connection between humans, the urban environment, and the natural system. So, my good friend Bob Bullard, who is essentially the father of the modern environmental justice movement, has often talked about the notion that zip code very much determines health outcomes and socioeconomic well-being. Well, we know from some of our own research, some of the research of people like Dr. Neil Debbage, who I bet somewhere in Hawaii as well, that there are disproportionate exposures of communities to things like heat and flooding, hurricanes, and so forth. And so recently, when we talk about just geographies, I've been moving my thinking beyond just the reporting of what's happening. That, to me, is almost the low-hanging fruit. We know that climate is changing. We know extreme weather is happening. And we know that there are disproportionate vulnerabilities in certain communities. But what can we do about it? And I'm sort of done being a reporter. And I say that somewhat loosely in the sense that, of course, my scholarship is anchored in rigor. But it's reporting on the fact that there's disproportionate exposure to heat, or it's reporting on the fact that septic systems are failing in disproportionate numbers in the Black Belt South due to extreme rainfall. So I've been thinking about this concept of what I call engineering cities for thermal justice. Talk about just geographies. We know that through redlining and other practices of a past era that there are certain disparities in cities related to heat. But we can engineer these cities for thermal justice if we think about the technology and the approaches. But I'm not actually doing this on purpose, but it's really weaving together some of the research that many of my students have done over the years. Mariana has done work on co-production of knowledge. And this is something that I really want to anchor in for a moment as we listen. There are studies, thought processes, and engagement that we all do with communities. But one of the things that I've increasingly sort of grown weary of, and I know the community has grown weary of it too, is just being studied. We get our grants, we have our book projects, we go into these communities, we study them, and then we leave. We have to, first of all, co-produce knowledge from the start and then stay and earn trust and resilience and move forward together. And that's something that I'm increasingly aware of as I've shifted much of my research from the reporting to engagement and what can we do on the ground and through some of our technological approaches. I have a great idea about how we can redistribute heat in Atlanta right now to remove some of the inequities in heat. But maybe that's not what the community wants. Maybe they just need a different approach to stop flooding in Proctor Creek. And so that engagement from the start is one of the sort of pieces in the toolkit, Marilyn, that also help us move towards more just geography.
Thank you. Go ahead. And I have,
So may I continue, or do you have another question?
no questions. As you say, change everything. You go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about what Marshall was leading us to consider in our greater and constantly expanding understanding of the urban. And that does remind me that we must pay attention to the fact that while a little more than half of the planet's 8 billion people are now living in some kind of urban environment, that means the other half are not. And the urban and rural, as we in geography have learned to say, is not an opposition, but a continuum. And the continuum holds all kinds of difficulties and clues and possibilities for realizing justice. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. One is some people I've done talks for. I haven't actually visited Brazil yet, although my book, Golden Gulag, was just translated into Portuguese by an amazingly patient Brazilian geographer named Bruno Xavier, and it's just come out. So 15 years or so after it was published. And a lot of what people are struggling with in Brazil, among other things, is not only the density of informal housing in urban areas, the racial order that makes certain people or certain groups more vulnerable to premature death and so forth, but also people have been fighting for 40 years and longer and winning the battle over making land fulfill its social purpose. That happens to be in the Brazilian Constitution, not in the US Constitution. It's in quite a few constitutions. And so the MST, the Rural Landless Workers Movement, has been doing land occupations in rural areas and starting villages and communities where they grow food, not only for personal consumption. It's not a subsistence economy. It's an economy that grows healthy food that they then make available at affordable prices to people in urban areas, to people who are behind blockades, such as in Venezuela and Cuba and beyond. And MST shares a lot of knowledge with people around the world who are struggling over making certain that land and water fulfill their social purpose. And they also have done a lot of connecting between the more rural areas of Brazil and beyond and more urban, constantly growing cities. So that's one example, and I want to just abuse the privilege of the lectern and give a second one. And the second one is in Eastern Kentucky today. Today, there's a group of people who are fighting, yet again, a proposed federal prison to be built in Letcher County, Kentucky. This is southeastern Kentucky. It's a place that was devastated by coal mining, especially mountaintop removal coal mining. Whitesburg is the major town, I suppose, in the county. And the Federal Bureau of Prisons had tried to cite one prison there that was fought back successfully 5 years ago, and suddenly, boom, they popped up with another suggestion. So one of the things that a number of us are doing at the call of the coalition on the ground who are fighting this prison is helping connect the urban places, which is where prisoners are somewhat more likely to come from, although rural imprisonment is rising, and the rural places where prisons are cited, and putting together an understanding that they're all part of a single environmental justice community that has all these differential aspects to it, but it's one thing. It's one thing. And one of the ways that in my comments on the draft EIS that I tried to show the truth of this was in the fact that one of the problems that the site proposed for the prison has to resolve is the fact that there are you all sitting down? 9.2 million cubic yards of mine spoil. 9.2 million cubic yards of mine spoil. That's enough to fill the Empire State Building almost 7 times. And it's got arsenic and other toxins in it. And the proposal is that all of this mine spoil will somehow be magically removed from that place so they can build a prison and taken where? Well, Bob Bullard knows the answer. You know, Marshall Shepard knows the answer. We all know the answer. That 7 Empire State Buildings worth of mine spoil will be put somewhere where people are already more likely to have been exposed to carcinogens, to be exposed to group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, whether urban or rural. And so that's another way to sort of think the big picture and bring these things together, even as the actual community members on the ground will focus on the aspect of this larger problem of organized abandonment that bites into their existence. So what we can do as justice advocates, as abolitionists, is to help people understand that what bites into their existence matters, and to recognize that what bites into somebody else's existence connects to theirs. So I'm kind of saying, in other words, what Marshall said.
Thank you. Now, I want to leave this time for if there are questions from the audience. Is there anyone who has a question? Because if you don't, I do. Tom.
Marilyn, thank you for your service to us. Thank you for the 2 awards that you have designated as the past president, and thank you for including them in this discussion, this conversation. What I'd like to ask you to do, though, is recognize you also are a distinguished leader in this field, and I'd like to ask you to answer the second question that you posed, how to move that arc of justice forward. From your perspective, do you have any suggestions for us as individuals, back in our home settings, and particularly here in the AAG?
Well, I wasn't expecting to answer questions. And truth be told, I don't have a simple do this answer. What I do have, as I'm thinking on my feet and I understand that I'm standing on my feet, is what popped into my head is in our organization, Geography, we have more than a movement. We have activism. We have everything on the front of equity, diversity, and inclusion. go work on that, go support that. And Risha here has developed a whole strategy of how we can take ourselves and take the organization forward on that front. And that's where I would start. Yeah. Oh, phew. Another question for our Woodies.
He just reminded us of why we do doctoral dissertation defenses.
Yes. Yeah. Because if I don't see a hand, I'm going to ask my last one. I see one here.
Marshall, this is Jerry Dobson. For the audience's benefit, I'll add that he and I grew up in the same town in Georgia.
Yes, we did.
Your book on the 2020 awakening, that was a very clear plead for a conversation, for dialogue. Did you get many takers? Did anything come out of that?
You know, thank you for mentioning that. The book that I wrote, The Race Awakening of 2020, a six-step guide, you know, I woke up one morning and just wrote that book out of disgust and frustration. It was at a time when the George Floyd incident was happening, and I, as an African-American male with a 16-year-old son, I just felt that I needed to say something. I actually had people asking me my viewpoints on things, and I tend to try to be very pragmatic about things. And so I just wrote down my thoughts, it wasn't written from a scholarly perspective, although it's cited and written because I actually have academic training, but it's certainly accessible. What I'll say is that I had many takers on the book. I give you one example. NASA actually reached out to me and ordered several copies of the book because they wanted to use it in some of their training, because they also said that there were very clear, actionable steps that were laid out, rooted in my marinated experiences. And so what I would say is there's nothing necessarily special about my perspective. I think if you ask any sort of person of my background and of my sort of age and experience, much of what was written in that book, they experienced it too. They understand microaggressions. They understand walking off a stage and someone saying, "Oh my gosh, you speak so well." Well, I have 3 degrees. Of course, I can speak in public. Or they understand perhaps standing in a group of men with suits on at an AMS meeting, and a person coming up to only me and asking if I was the airport shuttle driver. I was actually standing with 3 other presidents of the AMS, former presidents. So my experiences aren't unique. I just tried to articulate what many of us understand. And I really appreciated that there was a broad response from many different backgrounds and perspectives. I wasn't preaching to the choir, and that was my intent in writing the book, because I knew that people, that many of them that looked like me, and perhaps not even necessarily look like me, but come from other sort of groups that have experienced this, would understand. But I wrote it in a way that someone that maybe didn't look like me could understand, but not necessarily feel threatened or challenged, but gave them an opportunity to think. So I think I am pleased with sort of the responses that I got, but candidly, it was cathartic for me. I wrote it for me. So if it didn't sell a single book, I was fine with that. I needed to release because I knew what I was feeling on that Sunday morning.
Eric?
Thank you, all 3 of you. This has been a really productive and interesting conversation. What I'd like us to be thinking about as we advance justice within the association is, how do you go about doing this in all of these terms we use, EDI and so on, in a way which not only does this within the North American context, but does not only stand in the way, but advances these goals internationally. As both Ruthie and Marshall have talked about, these issues are in many ways much worse beyond our borders than they are within our borders. And as we concentrate on domestic sort of justice, there's a danger we start to ignore the severity of the greater severity of these problems on a global scale.
Would either
Yeah,
of you? Go ahead.
that's definitely a danger. And the how do we? I'm a little taken aback by that. How do we? We do it by doing it. This is back to the model, which is not a blueprint ever. It's a model for connecting connecting struggles, connecting organizers and organizations, connecting scholars from around the world who come together to figure out and fight for such things as, a fundamental issue. Water should never be something that costs anybody money. And yet, it costs people money everywhere, and water is being privatized, drinking water everywhere. So these are some of the things. How do we do it? We do it by having meetings. We do it by creating research plans. We do it by paying attention to what's happening in the world. We do it by gathering students if we have the resources. I run a very tiny center and we get one and only one postdoc, but we do get the one. So we bring in the postdoc who can share a perspective that will add to, well, let me use Marshall's word, the marinade of our seminar that meets for an entire year exploring a question and sharing research with dissertation fellows, faculty fellows, and visiting fellows. Those are some of the hows. And they're kind of endless.
Thank you for that. I am aware that it's now 1:13 and we were supposed to stop at 1:10. So I'm really thanking you all for staying and for being engaged. And I will point out that if I remember correctly, Ruthie is 11 hours ahead of us.
Yeah.
So I'm really grateful that that you took the time to share your ideas with us, and you've said things that we're going to take forward. And Marshall, you're closer to us in time, but still, I really appreciate that you spent essentially dinner time talking with us about moving towards a just geography. From my view, you are both extremely deserving Presidential Achievement awardees, and I thank you for accepting the award, and I thank you for all of the thoughts that you've disseminated among us tonight. The conversation isn't over. That's what I'll say for everyone. It isn't over. We have work to do together. Yes?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marilyn. Congratulations to you. Thank you for your service as well.